Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast, a developer discussion that dives deep into all things web. We discuss topics relevant to developing for the modern web and the web platform of today, tomorrow, and beyond.
Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast. I'm your host, Eric Isaacson, and with me as always is Danny Blue.
Hey, everybody.
And we're very cheerful today because we had some audio issues, but we're doing good now. So before we get started, I'm going to go to This Week in Web. First of all, Facebook releases a new experimental JavaScript toolkit called Rome. So we don't know much about it, but it's still in its early stages. React came out with version 16.13.0, mostly bug fixes, some new deprecation warnings, getting ready for that React 17 where everything blows up. Snowpack 1.5 was released, and this is, if you're not familiar with, it's from Pika Package to get your web modules all settled. And they've added a new parser, like for faster compiling using the WASM technologies. React Query 1.0 was released. React Query is a React library, and it has hooks for fetching, caching, and updating asynchronous data in React. So pretty useful. Action Toolkit, a toolkit for building GitHub Actions in Node.js. And now it's on release 3.0. That was pretty cool. And NPM 6.14, which is kind of a weird one. That was released, and it includes a feature to show which modules need funding. So whenever you do npm install, it shows up, hey, you have 17 packages that need funding or whatever. So pretty interesting. And VueConf US was this week in Austin, Texas. There's a lot of talks, including CSS, SEO, state management, and much more. And that's it for This Week in Web. So our guest for today is Chris Ferdinandi.
Hey.
This is take 2 on this one, but we'll take 50, I don't know. But we had a good conversation, and we're going to continue that. We're going to start over for everyone. So Chris, why don't you explain who you are, even though we know for sure?
Yeah, absolutely. No worries at all. So, hey, I am known on the web as the vanilla JS guy. I help people learn JavaScript. I believe there's a simpler, more resilient way to make things for the web. So I have a whole set of tools and resources and articles and things for people around how to use more of what the browser gives you out of the box and less of the third-party stuff.
Excellent. So we brought you on to talk a lot about lean development. So, and it's a little bit different than the traditional sense of lean development, which is kind of to eliminate waste, amplify learning, deciding the latest possible, et cetera, et cetera. Can you explain kind of what lean web is to you?
Yeah, absolutely. So the lean web is a phrase that I didn't make up. A gentleman by the name of Thomas Fuchs started using the term sometime in the middle of, I want to say it was last year, 2019. But he used it to describe building for the web with as little kind of tooling and stuff around it as possible. And it doesn't mean never use tools, but it means use the right tool when appropriate and try and keep things as lean and minimal as possible. And so to me, the lean web is a set of principles around building things for the web that focuses more on the user and their needs instead of the developer and their needs. I think right now a lot of the way we build for the web is really focused on developer experience. And oftentimes the cost of that is passed on to the user. So the lean web is almost the inverse of that. Focusing on building things that are fast and resilient and just work really well for the user, even if that means a little bit more work for the developer. Doesn't always have to, but.
Right. I'm a big fan of that. And I try to use as few tools as possible. I actually, since we talked last, I actually started building out some of my web components, rebuilding them. And I was able to get it down to where to support IE11, I needed an extra no module, but minimal IE11. But everything else for the web components, I was able to get using dynamic imports, to get that modularity. The only things I needed were pretty much testing and running like a dev server. So I didn't need Babel, I didn't need TypeScript or anything. And I was able to get those packages really small and very, very easy to implement into any application. I kind of think you need the testing.
Yeah, that's usually a good thing for sure.
So I did need some dependencies, but my runtime dependencies were almost zero. Like I think they were zero pretty much for most of them.
Yeah. And that's really the bigger thing too. Like, not all tooling is bad. In particular, so the kind of the bloat, or where a lot of the bloat from web development comes in, I guess there's two ways to look at it. So there's some tooling that runs beforehand, but doesn't actually happen in the browser. And if you want to make this really, really simple, I look at something like Sass. Like most people, I know there was a time where like people were doing, at least with less, I think maybe there were some like in-browser compilers that were doing some stuff. But generally speaking, Sass is something you author on your machine, you compile into vanilla CSS, and that's what ships to the actual browser, and that's what runs. And that has no impact on the user. I mean, I guess it could if people like did really wonky nesting with their Sass and it spit out a whole bunch of like really hideous CSS. But generally speaking, the cost of that is not incurred on the user. But some of the tooling that we use, I think in particular, like a lot of these bigger JavaScript frameworks, those do run in the client, and those bring a huge cost onto the user. And that's really where a lot of my focus has been. There are some considerations with a lot of the other tooling, the stuff that only the developer experiences. Like, for example, those things can create gatekeeping issues for junior developers and people who are not primarily focused on development but have important things to add to the process. And we can dig into that if you want. But a lot of the bloat that we see is not from like testing tools and things like that. It's JavaScript frameworks and the stuff that's really running in the browser.
Yeah, absolutely. There's some people say too, like if you're not, I've heard this by several developers, but if you're not using a framework now, you're going to be building one. How do you kind of feel about that? Because I know you have a podcast of your own. You talk a lot about this topic in particular.
Yeah, I understand the sentiment behind that phrase. I think it's inaccurate and misleading. So I can see some scenarios where that would maybe be true. But the thinking behind this goes, if I'm using React, there's already a whole bunch of documentation around that. If I'm using Vue, there's already a ton of terrific documentation around that. Right. And so if I kind of build my own thing with vanilla JavaScript, I then have to go document it and teach people how to use it, whereas like there's already a pool of people who know how to use React or Vue or whatever, which is true. But those people don't know how your specific app is built with those frameworks. And one of the most, I think, beautiful things about React is also one of the more frustrating things, which is for any one thing you want to accomplish, there are multiple ways to do it. I remember Brad Frost joking when he was learning about this that he Googled how to do X in React and he got 8 different articles saying 8 different approaches were all the best way to do it. And kind of knowing where to start is really frustrating. And so if you kind of bring that back into this conversation, just because someone knows React doesn't mean you don't also have to do the work of documenting the thing you've built with it. And so whether that thing is built on React or Vue or browser native methods and APIs, you still need to do the work of documenting it. If not, you have an undocumented mess of source code. And there are absolutely times where a project gets big enough or has enough complexity that reaching for one of these third-party tools is maybe the right approach. But I don't think it's fair to just kind of say like, oh, anytime you're not using one of these, you're just building your own. There's plenty of projects that don't need that level of complexity and don't require you to build a whole bunch of tooling around it to do what you need to do. And even if they do, you still need to document.
And you feel like with vanilla JavaScript, you don't have to do this? Because I kind of feel like you do have to do some of that, at least with vanilla JavaScript, where you have to document what you do and all that.
I think you have to document no matter what. And I think the bigger point I'm trying to make is whether you've authored your project in vanilla JavaScript or React or Vue or whatever, you're still writing documentation. And I don't think the amount of documentation you need to write is inherently greater just because you didn't use a framework. If you have a developer who understands how the web platform itself works, just like you could take a developer who understands how React works, they already have kind of that base knowledge. Like I don't think people need to go in and document this is what query selector does and this is what an add event listener method does. But documenting how you've used those things in your specific application is important. And if you built something in React with React hooks and all of the different kind of built-in methods and processes they have, you still need to document what you're doing with those things. Like documentation happens no matter what. And even if you don't use one of these bigger tools, I'm not anti-tooling. I just think React and Vue and a lot of these bigger frameworks were built to solve a suite of problems that a lot of developers don't have on the projects they're working on. And there are perhaps smaller tools that bring some of the same things these platforms do well without some of the stuff they have that you don't need, and result in an overall smaller footprint for you and your end users.
So one thing that I've noticed, like, and I don't want to get stuck on this one point too much, but I know it is like, I think this is a very common discussion that ends up being had about some of this stuff. One of the problems that happens if you go with, and honestly, it's even when you pick an unopinionated framework or vanilla versus, so for example, Angular is more opinionated than something like React, and so obviously more opinionated than something like vanilla JavaScript. So I found to be in some of those projects, depending on the project, there's less bike shedding about a particular thing in Angular because you're just like, oh, well, that's just the way that it works. So so when you do decide to say like, okay, we're just going to go vanilla JavaScript, maybe we're going to pick lit HTML as our view, as our view layer for web components, or not even for web components, something like that. Yeah. How do you help, even from from running a development team perspective, how do you help prevent a lot of that bike shedding that ends up happening, which causes a lot of this churn, which is one of the reasons that I think that people look at frameworks to begin with?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things. One of them is, so I think whether it's React or Vue or vanilla JavaScript, or I always end up leaving Angular out of the conversation. I know a lot of people still use it, but it feels like one of those like legacy system things today. But whatever the platform is, I think you ultimately need someone whose job is to say, this is the approach we use with our code base. I think that needs to be written down. You need to have someone who is in a technical lead position that when doing code reviews looks for that sort of thing. Whether that's, and just like speaking very generally, do we use functional programming or prototypal inheritance? Are we using classes, or are we using old school, like attached to the prototype? Code standards are important if you have a group of people who are working on a code base, even within a tool like React. Are we using traditional functions or arrow functions? And when? Like, you need someone who's ultimately going to make opinionated technical decisions about a code base. Last time I worked on a larger project of this nature, I also leaned heavily on automated linting tools to catch stuff that deviated from the standards. So I had a really heavily configured ESLint config file that flagged behaviors that were kind of deviating from the code standards we had outlined from the project. And kind of would break the build and throw errors at people if they tried to do stuff that was not in adherence to a lot of the standards. And I think that holds up whether you're talking about a framework or just going completely browser native.
Is there any tips or tricks that you would recommend for developers who don't always necessarily think about this? They kind of lean on to whatever is, whatever they have to work with at work. Hey, we hired you to be a React developer, but they're very conscious of, I'd like to make things simpler.
Yeah.
What do you recommend for that?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So, at the end of the day, I think it's really important to kind of use the tools that the rest of your team does. And so I definitely I don't think you should kind of go cowboy and just kind of try and roll your own thing and deviate from whatever those internal standards are. But, yeah, one of the nice things about, and I'm not a heavy React user, but a lot of my students and my friends who really like React tell me that one of their favorite things about it is how much of it is just vanilla JavaScript with kind of some nice syntax and helper stuff on top of it. And so I think one of the things you can do is you can gradually migrate a code base more towards vanilla JavaScript. If you're using React in-house, you might consider whether or not you actually need the virtual DOM piece of React. Is it really giving you those performance gains? Or could you rip it out and use something like Preact, which has the same API, but a footprint that's 1/10 the size because it shed all the virtual DOM stuff? It still gives you state-based UI and DOM diffing and data reactivity, but it's dropping the virtual DOM stuff to remove a lot of that code base. And the argument in favor of something like the virtual DOM is that when you work with really large data sets and really large UIs, you're going to get better performance in terms of updating the UI, because working with the actual DOM can be slow. And that is true. But React was built for Facebook levels of scale, and there are definitely some projects that have that, but a lot of the things we build don't. And your users are paying a penalty on that initial page load with just the amount of JavaScript that has to be downloaded and parsed and compiled and interpreted by the browser. And you're doing that in the name of kind of these imaginary gains that happen on subsequent page loads or UI refreshes that may or may not actually make a difference for you. So I think a really easy win for folks is if you're using something like React today, you might want to look into Preact as a smaller alternative, or you might want to look into Next, which allows you to do React as a server-side templating thing where the end user isn't paying the penalty of having to run all of that JS in the browser. Netflix did this famously. Let's see, I'm trying to remember if that was in 2019 or 2018. I think it was actually 2018. Find out for you right now. In doing so, they found that they reduced their loading and time to interactive by 50%. So their site got twice as fast by dropping React from their initial client-side view. They still use it as a server-side thing, but what loads initially in the browser is vanilla JavaScript and some pre-rendered on the server stuff. So yeah, I think you have options here, and I'm probably on one extreme, which is I use all browser native all the time whenever I can. But I think our industry is really far on the other side of always use lots of tooling. And I think where I'd really love to see us shake out as an industry is somewhere more in the middle. I think there's a much happier medium than what we do today.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because I work with React all the time, a little bit of Vue. And what I found was everyone who's used to working in an environment like React, and this is probably true of Angular as well, because I remember Angular 1 was like this. You know that one way to do it. And then when you see the abstraction unravel and you see the boilerplate you have to do with vanilla, which is not always the case, but in some cases it is, where you have to write out the same wrapper, like for yourself. People, don't want to use these native APIs who are used to that. Like, for instance, I did a web component inside of this Vue application, and the developer had said to me, hey, this looks really unwieldy, and I don't think we can maintain it. And I looked at it, and I'm like, okay, well, it's just simple functions. What is it about it that's bothering you? And they couldn't explain it. And I think what it comes down to is the level of comfort, because it's not the same when you deal with the DOM versus the virtual DOM.
Yep.
But people don't also know, like, there's tools that are like lit HTML and hyper HTML, which perform faster in many cases than a virtual DOM. But it's so different that it scares people.
Yeah, it's that's totally true. I think that's really fair. I do really love that we're seeing kind of this renaissance of micro frameworks. So, for a long time, even as far back as jQuery, there were all these like bigger libraries and bigger tools. And we're starting to see these smaller tools and smaller components. I also think it's a little sad that people are so intimidated by just JavaScript, I think, for lack of a better description. But I'm hoping we'll get there. What was that?
People get mad at me for hoisting functions. I don't know.
Also, and I don't even know if it's entirely fair to say that sometimes people are afraid of using native browser APIs. But so I think some of it can also be shell shock from like before jQuery. So and we talk about like we like I think we tend to heap a decent amount of praise on jQuery because one of the reasons that it exists is that all of the browsers had different APIs. And the reason for jQuery was to do like these clever feature detection things so that you would have this one API to put over top of stuff. And then obviously it grew into more and more things.
It was really influential.
Absolutely.
To what the web has become today.
I love jQuery. The reason all the awesome native stuff exists today is in large part because of John Resig and jQuery and what they did.
Yeah. But I also think that I do think there is still a hit to productivity when you do not use, and I'm not even saying like, oh, if you don't use Angular is my preferred. It's not it's like, oh, if you don't use Angular, it's it's not going to be good. If you don't use React, it's not going to be good. But I think that in looking at trying to use, like especially now that we have nicer browser features and looking to use them, I think it is important it's the same way with jQuery, looking why we got to the point of frameworks to begin with, because again, and I see this, like happen over and over. It's like, okay, we're not going to use a framework. Excellent. We're going to get our own set of functions that help us manage certain things. Perfect. Now we're going to take those and we're going to package those up in a thing that we can move from one project to the other. Sweet. Thank you very much. That's great. Now this other team can use it. And then that is how I think you end up sometimes in that thing of like, well, now you have your own framework that you have to manage and maintain and all that kind of stuff. So that's still the part that I'm 100% a fan of use smaller tools. Like I love lit HTML. Like it is one of my favorite things. Lit HTML and then also HTM that Jason Miller from Google made. That's like it's like a replacement for JSX, but it uses tag template literals.
It's getting harder to keep track now because there's so many of these awesome little tools coming up. It's no.
Most of them are pretty much based off the same thing, the tag template literals, or the virtual DOM. You have one or the other.
Yeah. But I think a lot of that stuff. Is very, very, very cool. But now we're also like, and I think you just brought up one of the potential issues, and I don't mean to sound like argumentative about it because I agree with almost everything that you're saying.
No, this is good though.
Yeah, but it is that point is that one of the reasons to go with like, okay, I'm going to stick with Angular is because, all right, I know the things that it does. It's like, oh, there's so many of these other different micro libraries, you can run into decision fatigue. And now, of course, that could also be referenced before is that you need to have somebody who is like, okay, you are in charge of picking these things. But then you still have to go and pick those things.
Yeah, no, that is fair. I think for me, one of the more frustrating aspects of not this conversation specifically, but this type of conversation is the underlying subtext is almost always that the productivity of our developers is the most important part of the technical discussion. And I really would love to see that conversation shift to what is going to provide our users with the best experience. I've heard people have that argument and then try and kind of shoehorn in, well, frameworks are because developer experience means we can work faster and produce more features and blah, 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 blah. But I feel like it leaves out a lot of kind of important details. It yada yadas over the implications of using these tools and often doesn't actually play out that way. In fact, I have a couple of examples of how using these tools has actually resulted in a worse experience for the users, not just in terms of performance, but creates all these trickle-down effects internally that affect the development team. But yeah, I don't know. I just I hear what you're saying, and I don't inherently disagree. No, I think you bring up a good point, Danny. That is, there are some times where you do end up creating your own internal framework, whether it's mini or full-sized. Mm-hmm. You are doing some kind of internal development stuff, even if it's just like helper functions and things like that. I guess where I maybe differ from some folks is I don't necessarily think that that's like inherently bad. I don't think that that's always a problem. I know we really love that these tools have been used by thousands of developers at all these companies and they come with all these bug fixes and stuff, but that also means you're inheriting a bunch of code that does not actually apply to you, your use cases, problems you have, things you'll run into. You're picking up everybody else's baggage too, and that has a real cost for users.
Oh, I 100% agree. And that has a cost for, like you said, for developers as well, because I completely agree about the conversation tends to be towards, like we've been saying, the developer experience and less directly about how this impacts users. But if anybody wants to see just kind of like how that happens or how some of this stuff ends up manifesting, a lot of times so there are a bunch of tutorials out there about building your own like virtual DOM wrapper. And you can actually do it in a very small number of lines, and it will function, and it will probably work for probably the thing that you're doing right now. But now try to take that implementation and say, okay, now we're going to make this more robust, and we're going to expand it out so that it is useful to everybody, not just us. You are going to end up you have to cover more corner cases. You have to potentially be more, like I said, be more robust with some of the things you're doing, and the size of it is going to grow. So when you are building something specifically for your use case, it tends to be smaller.
Yep. Yeah, for sure. And I actually had this happen to me recently on a kind of a bigger project where I was working with a team that was advocating really strongly for using Angular on the project, and there were a couple of they had some hesitation around things like on using maybe just like vanilla JavaScript or some smaller little libraries around things like testing and the simplicity that being able to use a Angular-based templating system provides versus, like old school concatenated strings. And so I decided to take 4 hours to just whip together a quick prototype. And I was able to convince them that it was actually a better approach for our particular use case because it came in at a fraction of the size, more easily did some of the things we wanted to do that Angular couldn't support right out of the box, and also addressed many of their concerns. Now, over time, that code base has grown a lot bigger as we've had more and more needs piled onto it. And so I can absolutely see kind of the battle here. I'm almost in some ways disagreeing with myself a little bit, but I still ultimately believe that at the end of the day, this ended up being the better solution. We could ship the entire front-end tool, gzipped and minified, inline in the HTML document, and it gets there in a single HTTP request. I think it weighs in at about 12 or 13 kilobytes. So, from that perspective, just kind of from a performance win, like you can't do that with React or or Vue or Angular. They're just too big. So from that perspective, it ends up with these page loads that are really, really fast. But yeah, it's a bit of a tug of war between some conflicting needs and interests, for sure.
I think overall the main thing to get from even just this brief part of the conversation is that it's not easy. It's not a super simple, like, oh well, obviously this is the best answer for X, Y, or Z reasons. But it's tough. But as like you said, like at the end of the day, if the experience that you're delivering is better, you can, like it maybe, and if you're having trouble with like I said, testing or something like that, it's probably worth the effort for you to figure out those problems, because those are your problems.
Yeah.
So you can solve those problems for yourself in a way that it doesn't affect your end users.
Yeah, and I just to maybe make this a little tangible for people, because like one of the things like when I have this kind of debate, people are like, I mean, like React gzip deminified is like 30 kilobytes. This is really not, like, in the era of like 5G cellular connections and really fast internet, like this seems like a non-problem. I mean, first of all, not everybody has those high-speed connections, not just in developing areas, but even within different parts of the US or Canada. There are very like patchy areas of the country that still have really bad internet connections. And those people might be part of your demographic too. But in September of last year, Zach Leatherman did this really interesting experiment. He was He was building his own thing to show his Twitter feed. He kind of wanted to own his Twitter feed a little bit more. So he was using their API to download all of his tweets and do some fun stuff with it. So he created two versions. One of them was a raw 8.5 megabyte HTML file with the full text of every single one of his 27,000 plus tweets. And the other was a client rendered React site with just one tweet in it. And what he found was that, according to Lighthouse, the 8.5 megabyte HTML file was actually 200 milliseconds faster to render than the single tweet React site was, just because of how expensive JavaScript is to run in a browser. And like, I don't know, that just really blows my mind. That is so much bigger of a file. Like, let's say conservatively, the React app was, so we take 30 kilobytes, maybe you have another 30 kilobytes of JavaScript just to show, I can't imagine how much like templating on top you would need to do this. But let's say it was 60 kilobytes total versus like 8.5 megabytes, which is, I'm really bad at math, but what is that? Like 80, oh God, I'm terrible at math, so forgive me. But that is a lot more. That is a lot more. I don't know. It's, I think we often forget, because a lot of times when we're doing this kind of work, we're working on really high-end machines with good internet connections. Like, we forget just how bad for performance JavaScript actually is. It's heavy, it's expensive, it's super fragile. It breaks in ways that HTML and CSS don't. And I think we can maybe do better.
Like I said, I agree. I know it sounds like I've been disagreeing. And like I said, some things I do disagree on, but it always depends on the situation. As somebody that has had to inherit many a legacy code base full of custom stuff, now, and they can both be bad, but I do know that as somebody that has to maintain that, if you were growing into it, I would rather maintain something that's written in a framework versus something, well, depending on the framework, written in an opinionated framework versus something that's not, because you at least have a starting point. But I think that's another part of the conversation, is being able to identify what you need now, what you're going to need later, and how you get there. And
I think that's totally fair. And legacy systems, I've had to work with them too. They're notorious for being like hacked together during the startup days where no one documented anything. And so you look at it and you're like, I have no idea what's going on here.
Yep.
Let the detective work begin. So
and let's
I
be
get
fair,
it.
I've written several of those types of systems as well. So I
Mhm.
am not only I am not only blaming other people. I am other people to other people.
Yep.
But
All been
it's
there.
yeah. No, but it's like I said, I think we're in a better place to do this now than we were, even 5 years ago as well. Just the fact that I think the biggest thing is templating, and the fact that we have several lightweight templating solutions. We are much better. So like we've mentioned lit HTML several times, and we've mentioned it on the show before because it's so good. It's just so good. But like you don't even need a component thing layer on top of that. You can just write functions and return these tag template literals and be done with it. And with JavaScript, module support, and with Edge now being in all the evergreen browsers, like you can just import directly from lit HTML and start writing things in. Like you don't even need a tool on top of it to do it. And I think that is impressive. And that is something that not even 5 years ago would have required a lot of tooling to manage.
Yeah, for sure. One of the things I've been trying to do is, so I don't want to just complain about how we're breaking the web today. So I've tried to put together some ideas on some things we can do differently. And again, standard caveats here. They won't work for all people in all situations, but I kind of look at them as a starting point. So I think for me, one of the biggest things is that old doesn't inherently mean obsolete. I feel like as an industry, we're really obsessed with always chasing the shiny new stuff. And there are a lot of like older tried and true solutions that continue to work today. So you don't always have to throw everything out and rewrite it just because new stuff comes along. And so along those lines, one of the things I'd love to see us do more is embrace the platform when we can. I look at, we talked about this a little bit earlier, but things that used to be really hard to do across browsers, or even just generally, like selecting an element by class used to be such a difficult thing to do. And now we have things like query selector and class list that make manipulating elements in the UI a lot harder. It's not always appropriate for every situation, but vanilla JavaScript template literals can give you a very similar syntax to JSX and don't require any third-party code. Again, not, if you're talking about data reactivity and stuff, you want something on top of that. But if you're just trying to generate a UI from some JavaScript, you don't need a framework to do that. The browser gives you what you need right out of the box. There are also a lot of like really interesting CSS properties and HTML elements now that do things that used to require mountains of JavaScript to do. This isn't just about frameworks. It's about the broader kind of ecosystem of tooling we use. So you can use the details and summary elements to create show hide or disclosure elements. You can create an autocomplete element using HTML's native data list element and a humble input element. It's really, really interesting, the kind of stuff you can do now. You can do like smooth scrolling, animating down to anchor links. Used to require so much JavaScript and so much math and so much kind of hacking things that the browser does out of the box. And now the scroll behavior smooth property does that with a single line. You can do sticky headers with one line. There's position sticky now. The scroll margin top property lets you make sure that when you do have sticky headers, anchor links don't scroll up behind that header and get hidden. That used to require a bunch of JavaScript too. There's all sorts of really amazing things that you can shift from JavaScript into HTML or CSS that are going to make your code base smaller, more resilient, and perform better for end users.
Now, the one point that I do have to bring up with all of this wonderful modern stuff, because we know we are going to hear about it from everybody as well, is browser support. Mm-hmm. All of this amazing stuff works really well in modern browsers. Now, modern browsers does now include Edge, which is nice. But for example, I work for a large consulting firm, and there are we have situations where we need things to work on old browsers.
Yep.
So that is often also one of the reasons that I've seen people say like, oh, we should do this in JavaScript instead. But some of this, I think, comes down to a discussion with your team, because sometimes there's a misconception, and sometimes it's not even even a directive or something that's been said. It's what's assumed. It's assumed that something that works in Chrome needs to behave exactly the same way in IE 10.
Yeah.
What I have found through conversations with people is that is usually not the case. It just needs to not be broken and be usable in IE 10.
Yep.
And so I think if you are, and they are legitimate concern. Compatibility is a legitimate concern. But I think if you approach it from a different place, in like progressive enhancement. There it goes.
Yep.
But trying to do things like progressive enhancement can help you get around some of those situations.
Yes, I agree. I think Brad Frost had a really interesting term to describe this. He used to say, I haven't heard him say this in a while, but he used to say, support is not the same as optimization. And so you can support browsers all the way back to IE 9, 7, 6, however far back you want to go, but not optimize for those browsers. You can make sure that the things you've built work, people can complete their tasks, but maybe fancier features like smooth scrolling or the autocomplete, those are features that newer browsers pick up and older browsers don't get. A lot of the more JavaScript-based stuff can also be polyfilled for you, and services like Polyfill.io will even do that for you automatically, detecting the browser the person is using and sending just the polyfills they need. So I think there are a lot of options here. And sometimes, I'm sure, Danny, you've even seen this, you get pushback from clients, but I think more often than not, we do assume that they want it to look and work exactly the same in every browser. And if you talk about it, they're actually really comfortable with that not being the case.
Yeah.
Not always, but sometimes.
Yeah. So the what is the details and summary element that you referenced? That's what it's called, right? I didn't know that existed till 2 weeks ago, I think. I found it. But like for everybody, so for everybody that's built a million different little accordion button things, look up detail and summary. Those are fully stylable, built-in things that do that thing that you just finished writing.
Yeah, and you can style them just with CSS. If you hit an older browser that doesn't support them, so at this point it's basically just IE, then it progressively enhances itself. So they're going to see the title and the content below it, and nothing will be hidden. It'll just be like content on the page. And then everybody else will get the nice expand and collapse kind of experience.
Yeah. And I think that's a very good example of the type of progressive enhancement that we were just speaking about that is oftentimes completely acceptable, where it's like, okay, if you're on modern device, if you're on a phone, which is probably where that expand and collapse is the most important to help save real estate. And then in IE 10 or IE 10 or 11, it doesn't do that. Okay. It's all the content is there. We're not stopping anybody from being able to do anything. You just can't collapse it.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's a good approach. One other thing I really like about details and summary is it actually emits an event when it opens and closes that you can listen for with JavaScript. So if you wanted to build a different type of accordion, like if you wanted to do an accordion group where one element being open meant that all the others were closed, you can hook into that event and close the rest of them in the group with a couple of lines of JavaScript instead of having a complete kind of library to do that for you. So there's just a lot of like really interesting stuff you can do with out of the box and a little sprinkling of magic on top now that used to take lines and lines of code.
Since we're kind of on this topic, talking about what is one of your other, like say, like what of your newest favorite features that is just fully in the browser, that doesn't require a library, something that people, because I think sometimes when we're having these types of conversations, it feels not as tangible, which I believe is a term you used before. But then also I think the kind of the idea of use the platform, I think that term has become it is not palatable to some people, but I think if we like the fact that I'm sure we just taught a few folks about the detail and summary thing who are now Googling it to try to figure out exactly what it is. But
I have an article on that on my site, by the way, if anybody wants to. I'll make sure it gets linked.
We will make sure we put it in the show notes.
Yeah.
But
yeah. So along those same lines, though. So I think one of the other ones that really catches people by surprise is it's such a silly thing, but like the download attribute on a link. So if you want a file to download directly instead of opening in the browser, like so you have like a PDF or an EPUB or something like that you want people to be able to download, you create a hyperlink, you set that file as the href, and then you add the download attribute to the link, and that tells the browser, don't open this file, just download it. And if you want, you can give that download attribute a value with what the file name should be. Otherwise, it just, whatever the file is named on the server is what it gets downloaded as. But, it means you get to skip doing people before have tried to come up with like kind of these JavaScript hacky workarounds, or you have to do something on the server that forces the file to download. And there's just this really nice HTML property that handles that for you, which is I think really great. And there's like a lot of these little kind of interesting things that I don't know, make building natively a lot more pleasant. That's probably one of my favorites, though. I really like the download attribute. And the smooth scrolling one is probably my absolute favorite, just because it's such a nice little flourish on the browser.
Yeah. I think my favorite one that has made it into fairly regular use is intersection observer. So that is a JavaScript API, but again, can be very easily polyfilled for browsers that don't support it. But just having a built-in way to detect when things, just so that you can have some kind of idea of where things are, is so cool. And
yeah, that one's a really good one.
Yeah.
Yeah, that one's a great one. Do you want to tell people, for people who are not familiar with that one, because it is relatively new, and a lot of people still use, like listening for scroll events and things like that to kind of hack this stuff.
Yeah. So intersection observer, and I believe we've talked about it on the show before. Intersection observer is this very nice API that lets you observe, for lack of a better term, when things kind of overlap. So the main thing that you can use it for, and the main people that most people use it for, is for detecting when an HTML element is in view, when it is in the viewport, and the user can see it. And there's, and there are several other. There are different ways you can do it. You can change the target, like how you're viewing different things for different types of scroll and that type of stuff. But if you've ever had to, like if you ever wanted to do your own image lazy loading, or if you have a list of something that you need to fetch, but you don't want to fetch it if it's not actually in view, what you used to have to do is figure out how big the screen is, check the scroll position, and then usually just Stack Overflow how to check if something is in the viewport, and then copy that snippet into your code. Now, Intersection Observer lets you do that on your own, and it is very, very, very nice. And like I said, very easy. Since it's a JavaScript API, it can be you can polyfill it. So you can use that one API, and then in IE, it just loads in something else. Well, Chris, I think that's a pretty good spot to end on, talking about just some of the good things, not just the hard parts of this conversation and of this topic, but what just some of the overall benefits are, and hopefully some things that people didn't know about, and maybe they'll also now go out and check out what the browser will help them do natively, rather than immediately reaching for a library to help them do something.
Yeah, I agree. This has been great. I also, Danny, I really want to thank you for like pushing back on some of this stuff. I think it made for a much more interesting conversation, and kind of dug into some of the challenges of doing this, because it's not easy, but it is important.
100%. Things that are important are rarely easy.
Awesome.
All right. Well, all right, Chris. Well, again, thank you very much for joining us. Eric had to hop off a little bit ago, but I know that he extends his gratitude as well. For everybody that doesn't know, this is our second time trying to do it due to technical issues, and we had technical issues trying to start this one as well. So fingers crossed everything comes out on the other end.
Awesome. Yeah. And just one last thing. If anybody wants to kind of dig into more of this, I put together a whole bunch of resources just for web platform podcast listeners based on everything we talked about over at gomakethings.com/WPP. So I'll include links to all of the different kind of tools and things we talked about, and some stuff to help you kind of dig in more if you're so inclined.
Thank you very much. We'll make sure that link goes in the show notes as well. Awesome. And yeah, like I said before, thank you very much. This is a very interesting topic. And yeah, if anybody wanted to reach out to you, if they had any specific questions, what's the best way to get in touch?
Yeah, over at gomakethings.com is my home for all things online. You can find my contact information. Jump on my daily newsletter if you want to like really find this topic interesting and want to learn more, or if you just want to go tell me how wrong I was. That's totally cool too.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Chris. And thank you to everyone for listening. This has been episode 196 of the Web Platform Podcast.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
Yep. Take it easy, everybody.